1935 would be a busy year for Wright and his fellowship, but designing Kaufmann's summer house quickly became awkward for both parties. It took 3 requests from Wright to acquire the topographical surveys needed of the Bear Run property. Kaufmann assumed to see preliminary drawings shortly thereafter, but Wright's focus had instead shifted, having the fellowship work on the Broadacre City model. In April, it was trucked for exhibition in New York City by a team including Kaufmann Jr. It was soon after that Jr. departed the fellowship to assist in the family business. Kaufmann continued to show favor to Wright by display in Broadacre City as part of an exhibition at his store that June. During this time, Wright and his fellowship made regular trips to the Steel City. Aside from handling the exhibit, they also explored Bear Run. In August, Wright mailed Kaufmann sketches for an office, but aside from passing mentions of a waterfall cottage, Kaufmann was yet to grasp what, if any, ideas Wright had conjured for his summer home. "Will you let me know whether or not you have started?" "We're working. You'll have your results soon." On the morning of September 22nd, 1935, the phone rang at Taliesin. It was Kaufmann, who was a few hours' drive away on a business meeting. He was going to pay a visit to see what Wright had put to paper. Apprentices that were in the house that morning recalled different details, but generally agreed to not having witnessed any drawings of Kaufmann's residence until that Sunday. What should be remembered is Wright was informed his client would be in the area a month prior. Wright was known to brainstorm concepts for long periods, only putting ideas to paper when they were finalized in his head. He had 9 months to think about Bear Run, and had spent much of that time within the confines of his residence he so passionately designed to be one with nature. Bob Mosher, a member of the fellowship, spent the morning with Edgar Taffel sharpening pencils Wright used to distinguish the different floors on paper. Wright himself did much of the morning's work drawing in private. Mosher would later record Kaufmann's first impressions of the plans. Mr. Kaufmann arrived, and Mr. Wright greeted him in his wondrously warm manner. In the studio, Mr. Wright explained the sketches to his client. Mr. Kaufmann, a very intelligent but practical gentleman, merely said, "I thought you would place the house near the waterfall, not over it." Mr. Wright said quietly, "E.g., I want you to live with the waterfall, not just to look at it, but for it to become an integral part of your lives." Using a T-square, Wright quickly found comfort in the use of triangles, allowing him to stretch out a hypotenuse along the cliffs overlooking Bear Run. The triangles gave Wright use of his preferred angles of 30 and 60 degrees. It was easy to envision rectangles stacked upon one another with the T-square, but rather than be a solid block, he altered the position of each slab. Wright was doing what he did best, obliterating the conventional idea of a box. By doing so, the proposed house along Bear Run looked to be an extension of the cliffs, an increase of the cascading falls of water, and swung across the creek like rhododendrons. Wright's plans created a house with 4 levels. A small basement would be cradled within the boulders and bolsters that would support the structure. The first floor would be the living room and kitchen. The second floor featured what was planned to be the separate bedrooms of Mr. and Mrs. Kaufmann, while the third floor was intended to serve as a small guest room. Each space was defined by the balconies overlapping not just each other, but Bear Run below. The terraces created as a result of these design choice would create spaces for entertainment, a specialty of Lillian Kaufmann. The cantilevers called for the use of reinforced concrete, which would make this house the first private residence Wright worked with such material. The counterbalance, which would keep the balconies aloft, was cleverly concealed as an overhead concealing the driveway. The entire house would tower over Bear Run at approximately 40 feet, one of the tallest residences Wright put to paper. Each floor was anchored to a stone tower that would be breathtaking at night, for glass runs its entire length. For an initial estimate Wright placed at slightly over $20,000, Kaufmann was in love with the design. His engineers were horrified. They feared the spring floodwaters would threaten the foundation, the cliffs were unstable to support the weight of the structure, and the cantilevers would crumble under their own weight. Nevertheless, Kaufmann was eager to see his retreat realized. As early as November, a quarry was opened on site to begin excavating Pottsville sandstone. But Wright would not mail the final plans for the house until February of 1936, by which point Kaufmann was on a winter getaway to Europe and was unable to reply until April. Where these miscommunications were harmless in pre-planning, they would soon take their toll on everyone involved with construction. In late April, Wright paid a visit to Bear Run on his way to a lecture in Philadelphia. Kaufmann's engineers had begun to stake out where the house was to be built, but was ill-pleased with the team. Carl Thumb, an assistant manager of the Kaufmann department store, was coordinating the daily developments at Bear Run. This included the contract work of Norbert Zeller, who had worked on quarrying the stone downstream and had finished a crude bridge across Bear Run. In addition, Kaufmann had hired a former fellowship apprentice named Abe Dombar. Dombar had not departed Taliesin on the best terms, making Wright perceiving him as a traitor. Kaufmann informed Wright that Dombar was going to assist Junior in future builds for Kaufmann's, which the master architect took as an insult to his own efforts. Wright wanted people at Bear Run he trusted. He replaced Dombar with Mosher, who was one of the apprentices most familiar with the Bear Run plans. When Zeller was forced to step away from the project, Wright reached out to a local architect suggested to him by the fellowship. In the most remote part of northwestern Pennsylvania, Walter J. Hall had devoted his life to completing an inn that was greatly influenced by organic architecture. When Hall received a letter and plans for the Bear Run residence, he was honored Wright would consider bringing him onto the project. Hall, however, admitted he had never worked on a project he did not have absolute control over. Hall's honesty only solidified Wright's desire in having him on board. Wright could do little about Thumb except wag his finger at Kaufmann. Your Thumb might be helpful in his place. His place wouldn't be trying to use me to get your house built, but letting me use him. By June, construction on the Kaufmann residence was in full swing, but Mosher and Hall found themselves caught between Wright's wishes and Kaufmann's aversions. Thumb suggested to Mosher that the thickness of the bolsters be increased. Then there was the matter of the hatch, a stairwell from the living room to the waterline, which Kaufmann saw as useless. Thumb pondered the possibility of a diving pool instead, which Wright saw as pointless. Kaufmann and Thumb would frequently question the way elements of the house were being designed. Mosher would try to find a middle ground, but was forewarned by Wright not to become a workman. Trying to get direct responses from Wright was growing difficult, as he had recently accepted a commercial commission for the headquarters of Johnson Wax. Tardy replies made Kaufmann more uncomfortable with the plans. The disputes came to a head on August 19th. The steel beams had arrived, but at the behest of Kaufmann, had been ordered thicker than Wright had envisioned. Not suspecting it to alter the plans, Mosher pressed Hall to begin assembling the 18-foot protrusion. But upon pouring the concrete, it was apparent something was problematic. A noticeable sag quickly developed in the center of the slab. It would later be discovered that the concrete was poured at true level, with belief it would rise slightly in the curing process. Instead, gravity pulled the weight of the slab below the level line. Mosher hesitated until August 25th to message Taliesin for fear of Wright's response. Wright mailed a furious dressing down of Kaufmann shortly thereafter. I do not know what kind of architect you are familiar with, but apparently isn't the kind I think I am. You seem not to know how to treat a decent one. I've put so much more into this house than you or any other client has a right to expect that if I haven't your confidence, to hell with the whole thing. Wright recalled Mosher at the end of the month, hoping Hall could supervise the rest of the build. While Hall enjoyed having complete freedom, lacking a member of the fellowship on site made it difficult to decipher Wright's unit system. No sooner had Kaufmann received inflammatory messages from Taliesin that letters for reconciliation were also arriving. Though it would pain him to admit it, Wright needed this house to succeed more than Kaufmann could ever desire to have it erected. In October, Wright sent Edgar Taffel to be his new supervisor at Bear Run. Like Mosher, Taffel had assisted in the drawings of the Kaufmann residence. Upon arriving, he found Hall hard at work on pouring concrete to create the second floor slab, but as the concrete began to settle, cracks began to take hold. Hall was regretful of laying the slabs over the steel mullions to save the cost of welding them, surmising the cracks were the result of no expansion joints. But as the slab for the third floor began to be laid, Multiple fractures were appearing in the southeast corner of the structure. On coming to the job this morning, I discovered a new crack that took all the pleasure I have had out of this job away from me. The onset of winter brought construction to a pause along Bear Run. Kaufmann was at unease not only by the precarious state his unfinished retreat appeared in, but by the fact its visionary had fallen gravely sick with pneumonia. In his fever-induced slumber, Wright would murmur how something was too heavy. Hall spent those agonizing weeks watching the lines of the partially built house. Stubbornly, both Wright and his masterpiece in progress held firm to see the calendar change to 1937. Once Wright was able to move on his own again, he requested for Hall to pay him a visit at Taliesin. He wished to go over changes in flooring material and how Hall should accommodate paving the base. Hall made mention of an unauthorized build, that of a 4-foot stone wall underneath one of the terraces. Kaufmann was following the advice of local engineers and was now loading the terrace for testing. When Wright wired Kaufmann asking if he would take full responsibility should his testing damage the structure, Kaufmann retorted, "You must take full responsibility for stability of concrete structures, taking into consideration the results of our tests." Wright mailed Kaufmann a contract, demanding for the client to submit to the architect's instructions. Although there was conflict whether the contract was ever signed, Wright felt he had assured Kaufmann's pledge from further meddling. Hall returned to Bear Run that February with Bob Mosher back on the scene. Junior was not comfortable with this move, for he had been friends with Taffel, and Mosher last left the project after the drooping lines of the first floor. But Wright had confidence he had seasoned Mosher and trained Hall to carry out his wishes this go-around. In the cold of Pennsylvania's winter, progress became consistent. Slowly, the house took its form. Wright considered sheathing the balconies in gold, but Kaufmann wished to keep from extravagant colors. Instead, Wright cloaked them in a waterproof cement paint. Hall oversaw installation of the flagstone floor that, originally sealed with Johnson's glow coat wax, gave the appearance Bear Run was rushing right through the first floor. Coupled with the wooden fixtures of the wall and ceiling, the living room seemed to reckon back to one of the first homesteads in the region, complete with a magnificent stone fireplace. When the time came to build said hearth, Wright dreaded having to shave the boulders. To his surprise, however, Kaufmann suggested leaving the boulder untouched. It would serve to remind the occupants of the topography that inspired the house's shape. Count one for you, E.G. By spring of 1937, the crews at Bear Run were hard at work installing the windows. In addition to a three-story glass shaft on the west side of the house, the windows split open at their apex, another effort by Wright to break apart the contemporary idea of the shape of a box. Much deliberation was made to supply the steel sash needed to support Wright's vision, ultimately coming down to Hope's windows of Jamestown, New York. There would require for glass to be held within only horizontal frames, as the vertical edges were mitered and butted into the stonework of the building. The sashes were painted in with a Cherokee red ducco. When the assembly for the hatch arrived in April, Fallingwater was officially closed off from the erratic atmosphere of Bear Run. As construction swung indoors, Pittsburgh engineers reported to Kaufmann they remained unsatisfied with the integrity of the building. Although he still retained reservations about the cantilever, he was now steadfast with Wright's vision and willing to see it through. Time began to speed as everything came to life. The cork floors and walling of the upper stories were installed. DuPont was handling painting duties. Fresh and Gillen proudly handled heating. Formica would top the counters of the kitchen. Fluorescent bulbs, an innovation only 2 years prior, were fixed in place to light the interior. Junior proposed the use of a vulcanized latex, often found on public transit systems, for the cushions of the house's furniture. Mrs. Kaufmann began to pick through her family's art collection, deciding on which pieces to bring to their Bear Run residence. By July, Mosher was satisfied to report the house and its appliances were structurally complete. In January of 1938, a letter arrived at Taliesin for Wright from Mrs. Kaufmann. "We have had the 2 happiest weekends of our lives in the house, the one over Christmas and this one. We've had rather large house parties both weekends, and it is a continual delight to see how beautiful the house adapts itself to large and rather scattered groups of people. We all three wish you the happiest of New Year's and are more than grateful for the joy you have given us. It had been a turbulent journey from sketch to reality. By the end of construction, the house came to cost nearly $70,000. Notwithstanding going over budget and being displeased with the heating, the Kaufmann family were all too eager to move into their new Bear Run residence that they spent those first weeks with hardly any furniture. As satisfied as the clients were, the architect had become preoccupied with his next commission. While working with Kaufmann, Wright had secured the rights to design the headquarters of the Johnson Wax Company. It too had fallen behind schedule, but was slated to be featured in publications within the new year. With little to show, Wright would focus instead upon promoting the Kaufmann residence at Bear Run. On the January 17, 1938 edition of Time magazine, Frank Lloyd Wright was the featured attraction, with a sketch of the Kaufmann residence over his shoulder. Only now was the outside world using a more simpler title, Falling Water.